another episode of Expected Buffalo, presented by One Pie Pizza. One Pie Pizza, 2185 Clinton Street in West Seneca, open 7 days a week from 9 to 8. Known for their sweet sauce, hand cut, cup and char pepperoni. Check them out, onepiepizza.com. Thank you for joining me on the night when we kick off four nations facing off. Canada really taking it to Sweden in the first period there. But fun tournament, good pace, very exciting. See how that kind of plays out. A nice, I guess, start opening ceremony in Montreal. So pretty good start to that tournament. Um, Tonight we are going to be joined by Professor Bones, Eddy from Expected Buffalo, the site, of course, to talk about Bandits, a little bit of hockey, but definitely more focus on lacrosse, not only really Bandits, just lacrosse in general. That is where we will get to. He will be joining us in about 15 minutes. So, over the next 15 minutes, you belong to me essentially. And I figured what we would do is we would start this off by looking at some trade options. So, there's been some new names that have hit the rumor mill, if you will. There's three players in particular here I kind of want to focus on. That's, a lot of people are interested right now with the break. There's some more things from a written perspective that I will get into over the next 2 weeks here. But three guys in particular I want to talk about. Two of them do have no trade clauses, but they're interesting to varying degrees. One is Jared McCann from the Seattle Kraken. We'll start with him first. So he has 2 years at $5 million remaining. I'm a little bit surprised that Seattle would want to move him, but if you look at where they are in the standings and where they are from an overall perspective, really, of this team, just, they made the playoffs a couple of years ago, I think it was. They never really hit their stride in being an effective team that can continually year over year be, competitive like we saw with Vegas. And that's, to be expected. The expansion didn't really go the same exact way. The players and the roster weren't that good. General managers knew how to handle it. They weren't just giving away players for free. But essentially, Ron Francis and that group there have not been able to build a consistent winner. So I guess when you think about it that way and all of that, that makes sense to why you're hearing guys like Yanni Gord and you're hearing Jared McCann come up in trade conversations. Now, McCann, the catch is, of course, he has a 10-team no trade clause, so you're going to have to work your way through that. You would imagine the price is going to be pretty steep there. Is it going to be Dylan Cousins? Is it Cousins and something else? Would they want Bo Byram? Is it a prospect thing? Do they want futures? It's really kind of hard to gauge what Seattle is looking for, where they are. Because you can make an argument they do need some futures. There's not a lot there from a prospect, perspective. They have to build that up. They're a new franchise. That's not to be unexpected. So there's a lot of work to do there, but at the same time, they might not want to just, I don't want to use the word rebuild because they're not really rebuilding, I guess you could say. They're maybe trying to retool is the best way to put it. So that's why a young player like Cousins could make sense. Maybe they'd have it to Jack Quinn, but that's not going to be a one-for-one thing for McCann. Maybe it's a piece of a bigger trade. That's a possibility. Byram could make sense with the way their defense is. It seems a little bit older. They could potentially use him too, especially with everything they got going on in that blue line. Like I said, getting older, lost a couple guys. It makes sense that defense could be on their mind. I have a hard time figuring out something there that works. And I think maybe what's holding me back there, I think it's a no trade clause, to be honest. These other two guys that I'm going to get into, one without a no trade clause, one does have one. I think it's easier to, at least for the other guy with no trade clause, to make an argument why that player could maybe be interested in coming over and waiving, where, McCann is coming all the way, from the West Coast and all the way to the East Coast, and a team that's not very successful. Just at this point in his career, at 20 years old and a couple years away from maybe getting another big free agent contract, that's not really something he's looking at. But, you never know. You make the phone call and you see how um, that whole conversation goes. But a very interesting option, a lot of points, scoring forward. The underlying numbers on him are pretty impressive overall. So if they can make that work, if he'll waive the no trade clause, I think that's definitely something that the Sabres should look into. And he's a player when we do our next update for the site is going to end up on our trade board. So I have to watch the time here because like Eddy 9:15, I gotta roll through these two guys. 5 minutes each, basically. Let's move to Noah Dobson next. We talked about him a little bit, I think, last week. His name started to surface. He's an interesting one because it's a right shot defenseman. He's young. He's going to be a restricted free agent when the year is over. His underlying numbers are pretty good. But what I put in the trade board article that I put together is there's. Oh, look who's here early. Professor Bones jumped in early. Look at you.
What can I say? I needed to hear about Rickard Rakell.
You got me in a little bit of. You got me in Noah Dobson. All right. Well,
Oh, okay.
you're here early. We're going to be talking about Noah Dobson and then Raquel. So what I was saying on Dobson, Eddy, as you jumped in early, um, I think it's what I was going to is the underlying numbers are really impressive there. But from a couple Islander writers that I know, and then even just from fans on general comments, I don't know if you've gotten the same thing. People you've talked to, is I get a lot of numbers are great, but when you watch them, it's not as pretty. And that that can be a different thing of a scorned fan. But some of the writers I do know, I take their word for it that he hasn't been as impressive as he has the last few years, and that could maybe be. Is it scary the right word? I mean, it's a guy you're going to have to pay, right? So you're going to give up probably a lot of assets, and a guy you're going to have to pay. Um, there's certainly some concerns there, but at the same time, if they are moving the player, they're not a clean, great defenseman, a right shot defenseman that young. Usually is going to come with a few warts here and there.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's for him. He's. I feel like everything that's come along with Sabres discussions of defensemen has been very age skewed, and this is another guy who's what mid-20s, so
Yeah,
you've got a little bit of that to like kind of remind yourself of the the greater scope of it. But I mean, I'd trust the numbers a little bit more, and there's a little bit of if you want to talk about another skew, probably with an Islander skew of how they're just always set up to play where something's a little less Islandery. They could kind of fall they kind of fall under the cracks there. But no, I think you, and if that sentiment's a little stronger, it might also mean a lesser trade target or a lesser return. So
well,
you just never know there.
that depends what Lou Lamoriello thinks, right?
Of course, yeah.
So he's one to watch. We'll keep an eye on him. We'll see. I don't know. The whole Dobson thing too, and his name leaking is also very like, do I really buy it because Lou never lets anything out, or if he does, there's a very specific reason behind it. And then today the news came out he just signed a new agent. So is this part of like a contract push here, where the Islanders are like, fine, if you don't want to work on a new deal, we'll just trade you. We'll put your name out there. And then now he has a new agent, and then it's like, okay, maybe we'll go back to the drawing board on a new contract. That kind of feels like the way where this is going here.
Definitely.
All right, the last guy I was going to talk about before we get into lacrosse stuff, as you mentioned, Rickard Rakell. So let's walk it back. So a few things here. One, the messaging coming out of Pittsburgh is it's I don't want to say unlikely. It's more likely than not, perhaps is the best way to put it, that he will be moved at the deadline. Now, the vibe I think has changed from maybe 3 to 4 weeks ago, where that was the situation, to now. He's still probably not going to go, but if the right team offers this, if the right team offers that young NHL ready prospect that we're looking for in a rebuilding Pittsburgh team, well, then maybe we'll consider moving him if that right piece is there. So he's got an 8-team no trade clause, 3 years remaining, $5 million. He's 31 years old. Again, the no trade clause is a thing, but maybe you can get by it with him already being on the East Coast. You can, I don't know, what is Rasmus Dahlin doing? Sell him on Buffalo while you're part of Four Nations facing off. See if maybe you can kind of tell him Buffalo's pretty cool. But what gets back to me and why I keep spinning in my head that this is a possibility is that there's a lot of Pittsburgh Buffalo connection. It goes back to early in the season. There's been a lot of conversation I think that Dubas and Adams have had, from what I understand. I thought early in the year I heard the name Michael Bunting a lot, but I don't know if that's really an option. A couple weeks ago I talked about the Pedersen interest, and then here's Rickard Rakell, who I do believe that they would have interest in if he was available. And I do think that there's one particular prospect that the Penguins are interested in. This is where it gets more from what I've been told to kind of connecting dots and figuring out a piece here. Because if you start to look at all the dot connecting, we have Friedman a couple of weeks ago saying that the Penguins and Sabres have talked, and the Penguins like the Sabres' young prospects. And then the message out of Pittsburgh is, well, we'll take an NHL ready prospect for Rakell if he's there. And then from what I've been told, the Penguins front office likes Consta Hellenius. It kind of, seems to be a couple things here where you can start to make assumptions. Again, making assumptions, you know what happens when you assume. I don't need to say it, but we all know what happens when you assume. But this is the time of the year where you start dot connecting and putting things together that could make sense, and maybe you're not surprised when it happens, or maybe it never does. But that's the type of season we're in right now. But I'm curious your thoughts on Rakell. Again, 31 years old. He's not young anymore. There's still 3 years left. To me, I'd be interested. I think he fits. I think he's another Zucker, which is not an issue at all. Kind of a player that they could use. Some people might not love the size aspect of it, but I still think he's a good player that can help this team.
Yeah, and he doesn't necessarily have that. He kind of has that Zucker like fresh perspective of having been through both. Some really really low times with an organization in Anaheim, and then coming up here with Pittsburgh, where it's kind of like we're doing everything we can to keep this thing going out of respect for the guys that have done this, but also like it's not really working.
Yeah.
So, as that one piece that's not part of the core, I think that that might be the one that slips through the cracks. But like from a Pittsburgh perspective, you probably shouldn't do this. But like if he becomes available, these are the kind of guys where Kevin in that one press conference was talking about, I can go sign Craig Anderson and the age thing won't be a talking point anymore and all that. But like 31, like he can, if he's gonna be a UFA at 35, like there just haven't been players in this organization for years now that have kind of fallen along that mid contract length there. So if you're talking about something has to change and something has to be done differently, while you kind of don't want to give up on everyone or give up on the concept that like a group can grow together, this is the kind of guy that you have to fill in. And if he ends up having probably not as many goals per se, but as much of like that age group impact as Skinner did a couple of years ago, then that's really the kind of guy you have to go for, especially because he does have the defensive side of it too, that we never really saw with Skinner.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I was thinking as you were talking, the interesting thing you could think here too is if the Penguins' target ideally is a future, or let's just say for argument's sake it's Hellenius, you could use a prospect to go get this player, but then you have more pieces to go do something else still. You can flip Cousins for something else. So you could take one of your other assets, you have to go something else. So it's not like a Cousins trade when you make that, like that's your big trade if that ends up what's happening. Where this one is more kind of a, I don't want to say secondary, maybe it's kind of not a fair way thing to put on Rakell, but it's a complementary trade if you want. It's not a huge one, but a pretty good one, and then you can have your huge one still. And if you put that together, that's two pretty big changes to your roster, and then maybe you're starting to build something moving forward.
Right, and it fits into that like that mid tier of trades where it's like, oh cool, this is a nice little addition here. Now just do that one more thing, and then Cousins would be that one more thing that we've been waiting for. But we're still waiting there. they definitely like. I think there's really no secret. They need new pieces here that can kind of get that funk of here we go again out, while like I said, not really mortgaging those younger guys, understanding that like an age curve's an age curve. Like at some
Yeah.
point, guys are it's just going to click at the same time, but you don't have that luxury that you did even 3 years ago, of what's now going to be 14 years. So
Yeah.
just gotta try something new, and I think that both sending a statement of a core piece, if you want to consider the captains the core, out, and then also bringing guys that have been around the block in different places and can kind of give that experience alongside of it. I think that's there's just plenty of opportunities to do that. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So it's 9:15, which means that it's lacrosse time. That is the time we told people that we would be starting lacrosse talk. So we are going to circle back to a Sabres question at the end because I do have one for you. But we're going to start off by talking about the. I don't want to say the only good team in Buffalo because they're not anymore because the Bills, they're a pretty good team themselves. But let's start with the undefeated Buffalo Bandits, 6-0. They play the Toronto Rock on Valentine's Day this week after playing because they played like one game in 4 weeks because of this goofy lacrosse schedule that goes on here.
Yeah, my
Um,
conspiracy there is that it wasn't like this last week wasn't supposed to be a bye week. But you kind of got to do that thing where like,
just in case the Super
people
Bowl.
might be busy this
Yeah.
weekend.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, they got a back to back this weekend, and then I think they have another one in a couple weeks where so they'll be playing 12 games in the next 10 weeks to finish out the year. But yeah, there's always weird quirks like that too. Georgia a couple of years ago, they played maybe like 4 games in the first 2 months, and like
Jeez.
they started, they lost all four, and it was like they started getting hot as the season went on, and they were talking about it. And it's like, yeah, we just haven't been together at all.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
it's just kind of a thing where it's like, it's just it's all about arena availability still, just based on where the league is. So, but yeah, to transition to the Bandits from there, I think it's the best kind of start of a schedule you can ask for a team that has really not turned over since the summer,
Hmm.
and they really the 6-0 is really showing nothing that they've done this year has really not worked. They're pretty much, well, their power plays like, I think they're ninth or 10th right now out of the 14, but like they really haven't needed it.
Yeah.
They're putting up 77 shots a game. They're scoring 16 goals a game. Their penalty kill has been pretty offensive just based on the pure athletes that they have. So it's not really anything that there's been a need to be concerned about. And then on the other end, the way that they turned around this defense too, you kind of saw that at the end of last year when I guess what's carried into this season's win streak has started, where with the guys that they had banged up at the beginning of last year and things got a little iffy, and it's March 1st and you're 5-6. You trade for Paul Dawson, he brings that veteran safety valve, but then also all that time you've had to get a Cam Wires and a Zach Belter in there, and those guys were both first round picks a couple years ago, just being thrown into the fire, and now blink of
Yeah.
an eye they look like the Dawsons of the world. And Bryce Sweeting, who still hasn't played since couple years ago because he's been fighting knee injuries. You've sort of got that next tier ready to go, and they're also still super young. So there's been a little bit of mid-season talk right now, just based on all of the bye weeks that happened last week. I think there were only 4 games, but people are putting out their mid-season awards, and one of the cases was for Steve Dietrich to win GM of the year in the third year of Three-Peat, of what could be a Three-Peat. And it's like, yeah, the offense has stayed together. The guys that you want to be around are going to be around for at least 4 or 5 more years, and probably means you're talking some luxury tax there, figuring out all the salaries with that, while also getting that next group ready,
Yeah.
and also convincing the 42-year-old goaltender to keep playing. So
Yeah. So
it's
there's
just
a
a
there's a
little
few
bit of
things
everything.
I want to touch on to that. So the first question I'm going to ask, and I've asked this before in our Discord, is this out of the let's say this is the third year of their championship run. Is this the best team, really? I mean, especially from defensively. Like, I was looking at some of the numbers before we started. Like, they've by far, I mean, again, they've played a lot less games than anybody else, but still, they've by far allowed the least amount of goals. Now, that's part of your goaltender being excellent again. But still, like you were talking about, we talked about back then, like, the defense is vastly improved.
Right, they're about middle of the way through in shots against per game right now. I'm actually what I'm going to be doing this week since both local teams were on the bye. I'm going to be just going through the stat pack and putting everything into context like that. But yeah, they're giving up I think about 75 shots a game. Whether or not those are on goal are a different thing. But what they have right now is a little bit of sick freak in them too, where they're blocking shots like it's nobody's business. They just stand in front of the net and just soak shot after shot after shot. And it's really just another reason that like of course they're playing well out of the gate here. Like you saw it in the playoffs against Toronto last year. They just put their two back guys in the power play in the crease, and they haven't been doing that as much this year. But that kind of principle of we're just going to get into shot lanes, and if it's a shot that Matt wants to see, he'll see it and he'll stop it most of the time. Um, they're just continuing to do that over and over again. I'm just looking it up right here. They've got 43 block shots through 6 games right now. Paul Dawson at 16 of them.
That feels like a lot.
Cam Wires has 7, and like again, that's a second-year player who's second on your team in block shots right now. Like that transition from the Priolos, the Weises of the world, they're gonna be around for a while, and it's super impressive. And then, like I said, the back end, then those first couple of games of this season, he was kind of in a playoff form where usually he's not necessarily like an angles goalie where he purely relies on his positioning, but sometimes early on in seasons he'll rely on the defense to be in the right place and rely on his positioning to be where the shots end up going. But he was in those first couple of games attacking shots in ways that usually you don't see until early May. So whatever rest and relaxation he had in the off season is really helping out for him, and he's in this lesser schedule's probably been very good on his on whatever father time appointments he's had to make. But yeah, they're firing on all cylinders, and they've had a couple tougher quarters, but that's just the nature of lacrosse. You're going to have weird quarters like that, but at the end of the day, for most of these games, like you don't even want to say that they're not really being tested. They're passing the test with flying colors when they're playing.
So Matt Vinc, is it just like we're gonna just do 1 year until he tells us he's done? Like, I feel like every year they've won, I'm like, okay, this is his last year. Okay, no, this is his last year. Here we are, like in year.
That's the thing, though.
He
just like you take one look at him pregame and see that he's just like the most jacked guy on the team, and you're like, yeah, this guy's not going anywhere until it's time. There was an anecdote on one of the lacrosse podcasts. I think it was now 2 years ago. They had just beaten the Seals in San Diego. So last time they were there, I think it was 7-6. And Steve Dietrich was joking that we want to give. He's like he just wanted to throw a 5-year contract on his lap on the airplane.
Yeah.
And it's kind of been a 1-year thing. Now this is the second year of a 2-year contract, so there could be those talks again. But if he's still playing well and the team's still playing well and it's still fun for everyone, because winning's never not fun, he'll be around until there's a reason for him not to be.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go here. We're talking about a really good team, 6-0, three-peat in the horizon, if you will, possibly. Who's the biggest challenge? Who is the team that stands in the way right now?
In terms of known challenges, the first one is definitely going to be the schedule. Okay. This weekend is probably going to be their first real, test as a group.
Okay.
Toronto played them. They've had a really weird injury-filled start to the season, so they're down there at 3-6, and it doesn't feel great. And their offense really hasn't gotten too much consistency. So against that kind of defense, you're not necessarily expecting them to come out and guns a blazing, but when you've played a team, I think 15 times now in the last 3 years, you just got to be ready for anything in a rivalry like that. And then to have to come into town and host a San Diego team that is also not having the greatest start of the season. They squeaked one out against Toronto last weekend, and that's the reason that they are a game ahead of them. They've got a little bit of injury problem too, especially at the faceoff circle with Trevor Baptiste. That's tilted things in the possession numbers pretty much for most of the season, except for 3/4 of one game, and then he re-aggravated his injury. Um, they've got a young goalie in Chris Origlieri. This is his fourth season, I think, third or fourth season now, and he's still only like I think 21, 22. So he's on the other end of that age spectrum, but
Yep.
he's putting it together. But he's had his kind of voodoo moments this year. But you figure in this is the first time this team's going to be playing the second night of a back-to-back. Yes, they're at home, but you just never know with how that's going to shape up. That if San Diego starts hot, you're probably playing against the back wall there, and that might be another Father Time thing too. I'm not expecting it, especially as someone that's doing work with the Seals. Like, I'm not expecting Matt Vinc to come out super fatigued to start his fifth quarter of lacrosse in 24 hours, but if it happens, that'll definitely be one of the tests. And then other than once this weekend's over, it's gonna be, like I said, there's no more breaks the rest of the year. They have one more back to back. It's a home against Vegas, I think, on a Friday, and then on a Saturday they're playing in Albany. So that's a tough one too. But those are the two teams at the bottom of the standings.
Yep.
But in between, then the schedule goes Toronto and San Diego this weekend, but then they have to go to Pechanga, out to San Diego next weekend, and then what could be the game of the year up to this point is against a 6-2 Rush team that they've kind of figured it out this year after a couple of weaker years, and they're probably going to surprise some people in that game. That's probably the next three games are probably going to be the toughest of all of them, and then you got a home and home against Calgary, who's kind of up and down, but they find right now with I think about 8 teams are between 3 and 5 wins.
Yeah.
Right now, Calgary's one of the 5-win teams, so they're looking pretty good in the standings. But they're still a pretty young team that's still going through, or on the back end, that's going through a bit of an identity change, and they have an offense that kind of counters that with some more competitive, veteran experience. You play that team twice in a row. That's also something where you might see some cracks in the foil, but nothing that really could happen in the next couple weeks, pending injury, really is going to change the way we think about this team. It's just more a matter of what the final score is going to be at the end of the night for some of these games. But you play Vegas, you play Albany still, and then you've got, again, the way that the league is so tight knit right now, you really don't know who's going to end up being the ones to rise up and compete with them in that top 4 in the standings, where it's really just them and then this Rush team that's kind of knocking on the door to get up there too.
Interesting. So if you think like over the next couple of weeks with the Rush coming in, like let's say they split this weekend. There's no indication they can't win both because they've won every game, but let's just realistically say they split. And then they beat San Diego. And then I think if you beat the Rush, it almost kind of feels like you're cruising the rest of the way. Like you'll have a 3-game lead, and or at least a 2-game lead.
Yeah.
So
that
could be
the way they're definitely a champions are never satisfied kind of group.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
You might see some weird stuff, but I think that once the 1 seed is pretty much in their vision, they're just going to make sure they do everything to make sure they don't have to go on the road for a game 1 at all in the second 2 rounds, and then have kind of the ball in their favor. Because whatever team ends up getting that 8 seed is going to probably have to lug it out until the last game of the season. So it's going to be really, really tight.
Interesting. All right. So last lacrosse question, because you don't just focus on the Bandits, of course. You cover the whole league, but really, the team closest home to you is the Nighthawks, and it feels like every year
We
You
have the
tell
same
me you
conversation.
kind of expect like this is going to be the year they're going to break out, and then there they sit 4-6 again.
It's the same. I mean, it's been the same conversation every year. They start for the they have I did this at some point early last year. That out of COVID, they've played the most games without their starting goaltender, whoever it's been those each of those years. And they came into the camp this year, and Rylan Hartley had a tweak in his lower body, and it ended up keeping him out for the first 9 games of the season. And they're the opposite of the Bandits, where they had a game. They're the only team that played 10 games before this week, and they just
Yeah.
had their first bye week. So you get your you lose your goalie there. There, it's not necessarily the best way to start the season. With that being said, Riley Hutchcraft has come in and probably with a little bit more time to get ready for that starting role, just given the way that camp was rolling out. He played pretty admirably. Wow, admirably. He was like 1% short of an 800 during that time, and they had a couple stinkers in there, but two of those were against this Bandits team, and if no one's beating them, like it's just
Yeah.
a matter of the deck drawn against you because you're going to play them twice every year just based on the geography. Um, but besides that game, they really kind of had a stinker against Vancouver to go to 1-2, but then they played the Rush close. That game came down to they had the ball for the last possession and hit the post, and the long rebound rolled down, and then they picked it up for an empty netter to make it a
Isn't it 2
2-goal
weeks in a row
loss.
they lost like in the last second, the last like
Oh,
minute
that's
of the
funny.
game,
Funny
right?
you mentioned that. Since the calendar flipped to 2025, they've had 3 road games, and they've won all of them
Okay.
against teams. In their kind of group here, they handled Georgia pretty well when they were 4-0, so that was a really good statement win. They just went into Philadelphia before their bye week and had a really good game there as well. But then in the 2 home games, they took on Halifax and lost at the literal buzzer, and then had a second home game of the month and lost, I think, with 2.7 left on the clock.
Man.
So I think you remember in the opening game at home there was a streaker on the field in the third quarter. Um, after those two home losses in January, I just kind of sat there in the press box. I'm like, I think the streaker cursed them at home. So they have 2 more away games before their next home game. It's a stretch of 5 out of 6, I think, at home, and then they finish the season or on the road, and then they finish the last 3 games at home. But it's a tough stretch for them. I mean, if they can split the season with Sask, that would be a big statement win, and then go into Calgary and take care of business there before coming home and playing an Albany team that's kind of laboring, figuring themselves out with pretty much a team wide sophomore slump after their run last year, and then you already beat Vegas, and then you got an Ottawa team that, again, they're not necessarily a team that has an identity yet, but their defense has been pretty good. But they Nighthawks have been doing a pretty good job of, outside of the 2 Buffalo games and the Vancouver game, playing well against better defenses so far. So it's really all outside of Buffalo. It's just the same thing. Everyone is super competitive right now, and the way that the bounces fall, it's going to be weird. But you go into a season after a dispersal draft. There's really no bad teams, and it makes everything really, really tight. And that's really what we're seeing. And they've been in the playoffs the last 2 years, and they've bowed out in the first round both years. But there's really nothing, just based on the way that their offense is put up, and their defense is kind of in its own little groove right now. They're pretty banged up on the back end, but they're putting it together for the most part. It's just a matter of going out and having more goals than the other team in more games than they don't the rest of the way.
Got it. All right. Well, lacrosse update, very successful. I learned some things. This I can't. And actually, as you were talking, I like looking at the standings. I'm like, wow, you're right. Like, all these teams are kind of
It's
crunched
insane.
in there, right in the
Like
middle.
Philadelphia, when they played in Buffalo, was I think 4-1, and they've lost a couple now.
Oh, wow.
One two Rochester that last week, but yeah, it's super tight. Even when they split with Halifax, the game in Halifax went down to the buzzer too, but they did get the stop at the end of the game. So it's like that night in and night out everywhere across the league right now. It's probably the most competitive season that they've had in the NLL, and where everyone is in it in a couple of years, just in this expansion era now that everyone's kind of getting their footing in. Vegas as the newest team, it's, I guess, not surprising that they're at the bottom of that, but they're really still a team that's kind of figuring out their identity. But yeah, it's really good every single night. You really don't know what you're gonna get.
Good stuff in lacrosse. All right, so let's bring it full circle. Where we started, we're gonna end. And I told you I would have one Sabres question for you, and I'm curious. So we started talking about trade ideas at the very beginning. We went through a few guys: McCann, Dobson, Rakell. Do you? I think everybody does. Do you have a favorite, important, realistic trade idea? And you can't say Pedersen because that's not happening now. But do you have like a favorite player in mind right now where you're like, man, if they went and did that, I would be very happy.
I think you have to find a different Patterson.
Okay.
I think you have to find a team that's kind of having their own little identity crisis, and while it's different than yours, just based on where you've been the last 14 years, where other teams have been more recently, but you look at Vancouver, if they're going to be panicking and be thinking about something like that in the first place before the everything fizzled out, like those are the teams that you have to kind of meet halfway with. And I think the a couple teams like the Islanders have come up, and I think St. Louis had a little bit of steam there. There were no like talks or anything, but people were,
Yeah.
I think, in Discord were throwing around Kyrie's name. It's like
So
those are the
that
kind
so
of
he's
moves
the new
where,
number one on our board, and that's what I was gonna throw out there too.
aha,
Jordan Cairo.
yeah, you just got to find the next team to feel like they need a 23-year-old center that you can kind of, if it doesn't go exceptionally well right away, you can hide them a little bit more and go through that. It feels bad, it does feel bad that like Cousins is the guy that everyone you kind of like center this around, but
Yeah.
just based on what we're hearing in terms of how teams have interest in him and they see him as the guy from 2 years ago, despite everything else that's gone on this year, you kind of get a little suspicious of that, and you think
Yeah.
maybe I'm seeing something that they're not, but at the same time we're probably seeing something that they're not too, and if nothing else, I don't think it really necessarily matters what Dylan Cousins does in another organization. I think that if you need to make a move to signify that you're now 2 years removed from being 1 point out of the playoffs and you haven't sniffed it since, someone has to be the guy to say that this is not good enough. And, you know, but you have to find that with, Vancouver,
Yeah.
coming off a President's Trophy pace that whole season now, they're dropped down. Maybe Nashville's a team that had a little bit higher expectations this year, and you can kind of work something out with that. But I don't think that their rosters necessarily line up for that. And then I don't know. You could probably maybe you convince Chicago in the summer that like this Bedard kid is pretty good, and no matter whatever sophomore struggles he's had, he needs one more player to kind of like not necessarily do an O'Reilly level when he got traded
Yeah.
to Buffalo, but kind of go from there and like find that like okay, this guy can get us a little bit closer, because like if you're going to be pacing for 60 70 points for a third year, like it's a pretty lonely feeling, especially in a market like Chicago. So
For sure.
whatever whoever the guy is, in the way to answer your question, like you just have to find him. You have to be in every single
Yeah.
conversation with a team that's looking to have to make a change that is similar to yours, where if something has to change, we have a guy that where something has to change. We have a couple guys probably where something has to change, and the picks and the prospects alongside it, we'll figure it out later. But we need some kind of core shift, and that would probably be it.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. But I have, like you said, I need to find another Vancouver, and I think the Blues might be your team. They kind of remind me. I mean, it's not 14 years of a playoff drought, but I kind of feel like they're in a similar spot to the Sabres, where they're kind of lost at sea right now. Like they're going through a general
Right.
manager change, kind of like Steen's taken over in a few years. They just, they did two offer sheets, and it hasn't really worked out in the standings for them. Just had a coach change. So maybe they're looking for something big. Like the Kyrou thing, I'm not going to take as overly significant or possible. I mean, there's been a few small mentions, but unless I see there's a little bit more that comes out, I'm not going to get too crazy about that. But yeah, I think there's something there potentially with the Blues that you could look at. And there's Buchnevich, he has that new deal. He's 29 years old though. I don't have any interest in Braden Shen. Dreger said he's somebody that's out there, but I think if there's even a little bit of consideration in making Kyrou available, you definitely, like you said, you got to make that call and find out and see what it would cost, or how really far that conversation could go.
I'd also probably make a phone call to Southern California to talk about Mr. Zegras.
Zegras?
I don't even
Yeah.
I don't even know if that would be a good trade or not. I don't think he fits the core that they're trying to build up right
Yeah.
now. Like he's a little bit ahead of where the team is itself. I think that's a team you call. I think if you want to talk about good fan bases with really nerdy front offices, I think you probably have to talk to Seattle a little bit, but even there, it's like you don't necessarily know what they would
Yeah,
be
it's hard to
looking
figure out what
for,
direction
or
they want to go. Are they going for a
what to get
reset?
back with
Yeah.
them.
Yep.
I
Are they
kind of
are they
don't
trying to
know.
stay where they're going? Yeah, it's really hard to pick out what direction they want to go in.
But
All right,
yeah,
Eddie.
all right.
Well, I appreciate your time. I see that Sweden just scored, so that
Oh,
game seems to be getting interesting now. So I'll let you get to that. So I will let you drop off, and then I will do the closing. But we'll talk soon. We'll get a Bandits update again, maybe like another month once things get going here, and see where we are. So thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
yep. See you.
All right. Thanks again to Eddie for jumping on. So where did we go? Almost 40 minutes today. Not bad. A lot of trade talk today, and a little bit of lacrosse mixed in the middle. And we'll keep that conversation going over the next few weeks. Like I said, I think it was last week that obviously a trade focus with the team where they are is going to be a lot of the conversation right now. So we'll definitely have that at the top of our list of things to talk about on a weekly basis. And tomorrow, I'm sure on Mailbag Thursday that we will get some questions about trades. So we will have that conversation then when that comes up. And if you do have any questions, as a reminder, if you want to send anything for Mailbag Thursday tomorrow, the email to send that to is xbpodmailbag@gmail.com. Again, xbpodmailbag@gmail.com. And we will, or I will, discuss your questions that you have tomorrow. Well, thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate it once again, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Enjoy the Four Nations game tonight as it wraps up, and the U.S. and Finland tomorrow night. So that will be a fun one as well. And we will talk to you later. See ya.